Good day. A few days ago, I did a video for this channel in which I discussed the Chinese-US talks that have been taking place in Tianjin between Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman and the senior officials of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Here, perhaps, it's worth making a point about these talks. The Chinese have gone out of their way to make clear that the talks are between Wendy Sherman and Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Xie Feng, not between Wendy Sherman and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. As the Chinese like to put it, Wendy Sherman met Foreign Minister Wang Yi, but held talks with Vice Foreign Minister Xie Feng. The point is, of course, that Wendy Sherman, though a senior official in the US State Department, does not have ministerial rank, and therefore, as far as the Chinese are concerned, she is a lower rank official who is not worthy to hold talks with China's foreign minister. It's a small point of protocol, but one that the Chinese insist on, and which has, in fact, been much emphasized by the Chinese in their coverage of these talks. Anyway, the talks have now ended, and we can get a better sense of where they went to and what the results of those talks were. And there have been, predictably, the follow-up editorials in Global Times, which discuss the talks and set out quite clearly the Chinese perspective on them. Now, I'm going to stress here the Chinese perspective on these talks, because the United States and the US media have said surprisingly little about these talks, possibly because they didn't go particularly well from a US point of view, or perhaps because the United States hasn't really worked out yet how to approach China and what sort of policy it is going to pursue towards China. That, incidentally, may explain why it was, in fact, Wendy Sherman, rather than, say, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who actually went to China at this time and met with the Chinese. At this moment in time, the United States has not yet evolved a coherent China policy, and so it sends people like Wendy Sherman to China on what might be described as exploratory missions. Well, if this was an exploratory mission, the Chinese have made the job very simple, because they have explained in very clear-cut language to Wendy Sherman, and by extension through her to the United States, what China's position is and what the United States has to do if it wants a good and stable relationship with China. And the Chinese have also made it clear that if the United States is not prepared to take those steps that China wants the United States to take in order to achieve that stable and even friendly relationship, then the United States has an adversarial relationship with China. In other words, it will be a fight between the United States and China, and a fight which the Chinese expect to win. They expect to win it because they believe they have history on their side. They believe that their economy is growing faster than that of the United States. They are confident that they will overtake the United States as the world's leading economic power very soon. They are confident about the growth of their military power, which I have discussed extensively on previous videos in this channel. And they are confident also about their alliance with Russia, which they believe correctly to be a geopolitical game changer. And I have discussed that too in previous programs on this channel. Last but not least, and perhaps most controversially, the Chinese are confident about the stability and strength of their political system and the cohesion of their society. About their political system, I am perhaps slightly more skeptical. About the cohesion of Chinese society, as of now, as someone who has visited China, about that I have no doubt at all. And the Chinese look at the United States, perhaps they overestimate how dysfunctional the political system there has become, though I have to say they could be excused if they are overestimating it, but no doubt and unquestionably, they see a deeply divided country in the United States where partisan conflict has grown almost out of control and where the political system is not working effectively. So, for all these reasons, the Chinese are, at this moment in time, extremely self-confident, and this shows in their handling of the US. And I said at the start of this program that the United States has not yet worked out a clear policy towards China. By contrast, it's crystal clear that the Chinese have a clear position and a clear policy with respect to the United States. Anyway, that now brings me to the topic of the Global Times editorial, which, as I said, sums it all up from a Chinese point of view. And as I traditionally do, I'm going to read out this entire editorial in full. It's not especially long, and it gives, to my mind, a flavour both of the talks and of what the Chinese said to Wendy Sherman when she was in Tianjin, but also of the kind of policies that the Chinese are following with respect to the United States, and also it shows their immense and growing self-confidence. Anyway, this is what the editorial says. US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman began her visit to China on Sunday. One day later, Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with her, whilst Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Xie Feng held talks with her. Again, notice Wang Yi met her, Xie Feng held talks with her. The point of difference between the meeting with Xie Feng, which is the substantive negotiations, and the brief, polite, courtesy meeting with Wang Yi, which the Chinese media and the Chinese government have gone out of their way to emphasize. Anyway, to continue. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said that the talks were in-depth, frank, and beneficial to the relationship between the two countries. I should say that when diplomats talk about frank talks, they mean that the talks were at times rather vigorous and perhaps outspoken and marked by a certain measure of tension. And beneficial to the relationship between the two countries can mean all sorts of things. It can mean just that the two countries understand each other better as a result of the talks, rather than that their relations are going to be improving. Anyway, to continue again, Xie's expression of strong dissatisfaction with the US, as seen in a briefing of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, drew praise on the internet. This probably refers to the Chinese part of the internet. Xie sharply criticized the US's competitive, collaborative and adversarial rhetoric, in which the real emphasis is on the adversarial aspect, as the collaborative aspect is just an expediency and the competitive aspect is a narrative trap. Xie said the United States wants to do bad things and get good results. How is that ever possible? Asked Xie. He then continued by criticizing the US's arrogant approach in dealing with other countries from a position of strength. Xie even called the United States the inventor and patent and intellectual property owner of coercive diplomacy. In the past, China had stressed on creating a good atmosphere for China-US talks. Even if the two sides had very heated discussions, China might not inform the public about such talks. This time, China quickly made public Xie's tough statement at the Tianjin talks. This has solidified an important posture adjustment in China's approach to dealing with the US that began with the Anchorage talks. We will no longer make unilateral efforts to maintain the public opinion atmosphere in China-US relations. The basis for such changes is that Chinese society has become fed up with the bossy US, and we hold no more illusions that China and the US would substantially improve ties in the foreseeable future. Now, that is an extremely important sentence, that the Chinese don't expect that there will be any substantial improvement in US-China ties in the foreseeable future. It means that any ideas of a Chinese-US rapprochement have been ruled out and abandoned in Beijing itself. The Chinese public strongly supports the government to safeguard national dignity in its ties with the US and firmly push back the various provocations from the US. In the face of the malicious China containment and confrontational policy adopted by the two recent US administrations, the Chinese people are willing to form a united front, together bear the consequences of not yielding to the US, and win for the country's future through struggles. So this is a clear statement. China will not make any significant concessions to the US on any serious issue. It accepts that it is now in a state of confrontation with the United States. It is prepared to pay the price of that confrontation, and it does so confident that eventually it will come out victorious. In other words, Chinese society would unconditionally support whatever tough counterattacks the Chinese government would launch in the face of US-initiated conflicts in all directions towards China. Now, that, to my mind, is a warning that if the United States takes anything that might approximate to military action close to Chinese territory, China is prepared to respond militarily and to counter any US action of that nature with a Chinese counteraction of its own. The US should abandon forever the idea of changing China's system and policies through sanctions, containment, and intimidation. We hope US allies in the Asia-Pacific, especially Japan and Australia, can weigh the situation. They should not act as accomplices of the US's China containment policy and place themselves at the forefront of confronting China, or they are betting their own future. During the Tianjin talks, China delivered two lists of major concerns to the US that require Washington to change its course. Much of the content relates to the basic rights of Chinese people and institutions. China is not begging the US, rather the US, supposedly a responsible major power, should correct itself. Well, here again, we see China talking to the United States in the US's own language, or to be precise, the language the US uses when it talks to other countries. The US is constantly lectures other countries and asks them to correct their alleged misbehavior. we see that China is doing now the same to the US. It is lecturing the US, it is handing out lists of demands to the US, something which the United States is accustomed to do, but is not accustomed to receiving. And it is telling the US that it is the US, not China, that is behaving like the naughty schoolboy, and that it is the US, not China, that should therefore correct and change its behavior. This is something that the United States has no experience of. It has never happened to the US at any point in its history. And I wonder, and I would love to be a fly on the wall when the people in the State Department talk about it amongst themselves. I suspect that the reaction in Washington, in Foggy Bottom, will be one of incredulity, bafflement, and probably anger. Anyway, to continue again, the United States must accept a basic reality. China has developed faster than the US in recent years, and the trend of China's economy exceeding that of the US in the future is irreversible. The United States needs to live in peace with a strong and independent China. It is the US's illusion to contain China's development and to bring China to chaos and collapse like the way it did to the Soviet Union. By doing that, the United States will only mess up the world order and intensify conflicts between major powers. China's system will ensure that we have greater tolerance for chaos than the United States does. Now, I should say that those words, China's system will ensure that we have a greater tolerance for chaos than the US does, have been misquoted in some parts of the US media and have been misquoted in ways that I have to say does actually dismay me considerably. So we read, for example, in places like Washington Examiner, comments like the fact that China was threatening the United States with chaos. What the Chinese are actually saying is that if the United States tries to pursue the same kind of confrontation and containment policy against China that it did against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, then because China is not the Soviet Union, it will find itself in a Cold War conflict that it cannot win, and which will create chaos across the international system, and that chaos will destabilize the United States rather than China because of the stability of China's system, in other words, the cohesion of its political system and of its society. What this article says is not that China is going to unleash chaos if the United States does not do as China says. What this editorial says is that chaos will be the result of a US policy aimed at confronting and containing China, and that will backfire on the US. I want to stress this point because, as I said, I see these words misrepresented in various places in the United States. And anyway, to continue again with this Chinese Global Times editorial, for the Chinese people, we want to say that we should not take Xie's words as venting our anger. What Xie said is also a warning that China-US relations are likely to fall in the long run. China must accelerate the building of its comprehensive strength and prepare for the worst-case scenario of escalating confrontation with the US and its main allies. The United States wants to use strategic containment to crush China, and we must use continuous development and strength building to crush the US's will. Development is China's most important source of strength. We must make the American people more and more aware of how stupid they are to forcibly shape China into a strategic opponent. Whilst the US is putting most of its efforts into its diplomatic layout on China, China needs to put most of its efforts into doing its own things well. That way, China will continue to advance and become unstoppable. So there we see it. The Chinese say the United States can go around the world, it can try and forge alliances and diplomatic pacts with all sorts of countries in a fruitless attempt to try to contain and defeat China. But the reality is that China's economic growth is now so rapid and so sustained, and its development is also so rapid and so sustained, that this policy that the United States might be minded to follow is going to fail almost regardless of what the United States does, because Chinese economic growth and the development of Chinese society and of Chinese military power will ultimately always outmatch it. And that makes China's continued advance unstoppable. Now, there is, of course, a great deal that could be said about this view, this analysis. It is perhaps foolhardy to be quite as confident about the future as the Chinese themselves appear to be. Anybody who has familiarity with history knows that things can take remarkable and extraordinary and completely unexpected turns, and that what seems inevitable one moment entirely fails to come to pass the next, and things that seemed extremely unlikely can sometimes happen. However, there is also a view, and perhaps ultimately it is a sounder view, once expressed by the great French historian Ferdinand Braudel, that ultimately it is always the long term that wins. Straightforwardly, China is a vastly bigger country than the United States. It has many times the US's population, and sooner or later, given the enormous industrial, manufacturing, and technological resources that China has, it is inevitable that it is going to overtake the United States. Maybe it will not happen quite as soon as some people think. Maybe, conceivably, it will happen even sooner than most people think. Maybe, as some say, it has basically already happened. By some estimates, China's GDP, by purchasing power parity measures, is already greater than that of the US, and of course its manufacturing capacity indisputably is. So maybe the Chinese are being overconfident, or maybe their confidence, far from being misplaced, is absolutely on the nail. But one way or the other, as Braudel said, the long term has a way of winning out, and in a confrontation between the United States and China, the odds must be ultimately and eventually on China winning through and coming out on top. Notice, however, that the Chinese do place a limit on what they intend to do, or at least this Global Times editorial might make us think so. There is this very interesting sentence. The US wants to use strategic containment to crush China, and we must use continuous development and strength building to crush the US's will. So the United States according to this view in this editorial, aims to crush China, but China only seeks to crush the US's will to crush China. It is a more limited approach. It doesn't seek to crush the US itself. It simply wants to make the US understand and accept that any attempt to confront China, to treat China as an enemy, is bound to fail in the end and to result in extremely negative consequences for the United States. I'm going to make one further point, by the way, one which isn't touched on in this Global Times editorial, but which has been discussed in other Global Times editorials on many occasions, and which I've discussed, sometimes by allusion to those other Global Times editorials. This time, this is that the strategy of containing China has actually already failed, because China has already succeeded in forging and what is, to all intents and purposes, a de facto alliance with the world's other great power, which is Russia. China and Russia working together cannot be contained and cannot ever be considered isolated. Together, they make a formidable combination, which, as the Chinese, as Global Times also said in an earlier editorial, which I also covered, they forged an alliance which is far more powerful than the old Warsaw Pact, and indeed is more powerful than that of the United States and its allies. So this game of containment is essentially already lost. And though I know that there are many people in the United States who continue to insist that this Chinese-Russian strategic partnership is not for real, and that the two countries basically still are deeply suspicious of each other, and that they will fall out with each other at some point, I think that all these expectations or hopes are wrong. I think they are basically wishful thinking, and I think in terms of this de facto alliance between the Chinese and the Russians, it is now a done thing, one which suits the interests of both countries, and it means that the Chinese have another reason, a further reason, to be as confident as they are. But anyway, putting all this aside, what is the big takeaway from this editorial, and by extension from the talks in Tianjin? It's very simple. Both the United States and China now consider themselves to be adversaries. They are no longer partners in any meaningful sense of the word. They are the two powers that are competing for mastery in the present international contest that is defining the world today, the shape of our international system. The Chinese believe they will win. They have, as I said, Russia at their back, and they are confident about the growth and development of their society and economy. The United States, by contrast, feels that it cannot afford to lose, because the language that some Americans use to discuss this conflict is developing a kind of existential quality that somehow the United States itself will have betrayed its own ideals, will have betrayed itself, will have jeopardized its future if it is unable to compete and surpass China and remain the dominant power in the world, such as it has been since the end of the Second World War. And further, we have to take away from this meeting an acceptance of the fact that China is not going to make any significant concessions on any particular issue to the United States. On the contrary, just as it once did with the Soviet Union, it sets out demands which it expects the United States one day, perhaps in 10 years or 20 years' time, to come round to, and that the Chinese are prepared and willing to accept this confrontation, and they're prepared to pay any price for it, and that they're preparing also for worst case scenarios, which of course by implication may include military ones. So that is the division in the world today. The United States and its allies, China and its allies. The world is now the stage for this great conflict. We will see who wins. Thank you very much for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel. Please also check out Alex's channel, which you will find links to under this video. Please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, SuperU, and especially Locals. And can I particularly and especially urge you to sign into Locals? You'll find a link under this video. We have very high ambitions for what we're going to do on that platform. We are now thinking very hard and are preparing some exciting things that we're going to do there. So please do sign up to Locals and prepare for the wonderful things that are going to come there. And please also support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And don't forget to go to our shop and buy for yourself the amazing and wonderful things you will find in our shop. A veritable Aladdin's cave of marvelous things, of wonderful t-shirts and polo shirts and sweatshirts and hoodies and hats, and of course the famous, the wonderful, the extraordinary Duran magic mugs. And thank you again for joining me today. If you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and also please check your subscription to this channel. And thank you for joining me again today, and I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then. And let me say it once more, please sign up to Locals and wait and see what wonderful things are coming there. Thank you very much again for your attention.